I thank you, Mr. Brady. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And the motion is for this House to consider local bus drivers' working hours. Back in February, I brought forward my 10-minute rule bill raising the issue of local bus drivers' working hours. It asked for two things: a change to working hours and an increase in more robust, independent medical checks for bus drivers themselves. Mr. Brady, I simply do not believe that our current laws around the working hours of bus drivers are keeping our public safe. The bill that I put forward, and to which this debate relates, simply seeks to limit bus drivers on local routes to driving for no more than 56 hours in any 1 week and 90 hours in any 2 consecutive weeks. Doing this would bring the hours worked into regulatory alignment with those for long-distance bus drivers and coach drivers and HGV lorry drivers. Some would say that this is simple common sense. Let me put it like this, if I may. How can it be that a packet of cornflakes has more chance of a safe arrival at its destination than a child on a bus? I propose this in response to the terrible tragedy that took place in Coventry city centre back in October 2015, and in particular in the memory of the 2 individuals who died in that terrible accident: 7-year-old Rowan Fitzgerald and 76-year-old Dora Hancox. And may I start by paying tribute to the family of Rowan, Natasha, Barbara and Liam, who have joined us today. May I thank them once more for their courage and encouragement, and before them I recommit myself to ensuring there is an important legacy from their terrible loss. And that is why we are pushing for Rowan's Law, for the rules around local bus driver working hours to be made consistent with those of long-distance bus and coach drivers and HGV drivers. There were many others injured that day, including Rowan's cousin Paige, but it could have been even worse. Were it not for the brave actions of Tyle Portlock, who managed to disperse those pedestrians outside the Sainsbury's, a great many others would have been killed or seriously injured. And for the benefit of this minister, may I just describe what happened that day in Coventry. It was a busy Saturday afternoon. A video shown at the inquest revealed how the tragedy could have claimed more lives. In it, the bus careers across the main road, striking another bus, then lamppost, before hurtling down a pavement and ploughing into a bus stop and the supermarket. As I have said repeatedly since, there was an absolute inevitability that such a tragedy would happen. The driver that day was Mr. Chander, a 77-year-old male, also of Leamington Spa. In the year leading up to the fatal accident, Mr. Chander had worked an average of 47 hours per week. However, that statistic disguises the number of hours worked during busy periods, namely in school term time. At these times, Mr. Chander was frequently working in excess of 50 to 60 hours a week and could drive school specials. These hours are long by any measure, but particularly for a driver in his mid-70s. In the 4 weeks leading up to the crash, he had driven 62 hours, 76 hours, 76 hours, and 72 hours respectively, an average of 72 hours a week over that period. And this despite a shocking safety record and some 16 written complaints from passengers who, over the preceding couple of years, had contacted the company to register his erratic behaviour and the innumerable incidents. This is entirely legal under current UK law, and that is what many of us are seeking to address. However, this issue is not new, and the crash in 2015 could have been prevented, because back in March of that year, before the tragedy in fact, the Right Honourable Member for Islington North and the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington put forward such changes through an early day motion. That was 4 years ago. Currently, the British laws which regulate bus driver hours on local routes of less than 50 kilometres limit driving to 10 hours a day with no weekly or fortnightly limit, except that in any 2 consecutive weeks there must be at least one period of 24 hours off duty. This means it is entirely legal for a local bus driver to drive 130 hours over a period of 2 weeks. And if you extrapolate that, a driver could work 260 hours in 1 day under 4-week period, which would make it an extraordinary distance. Under EU law, however, a long-distance bus driver or lorry driver cannot drive more than 56 hours a week or more than 90 hours over 2 consecutive weeks. And I believe this tragedy could have been avoided, potentially, if driving hours for local bus drivers were capped at 56 hours a week and no more than 90 hours over the 2 consecutive weeks, as is already the case for long-distance bus drivers and HGV drivers. So when I met with the Minister and the family just a month ago, she shared with us the DFT data, which showed an average of 42 hours a week. But I believe that hides the reality. What really is happening at the extreme margins? Because what is reported is that 10,000 bus or coach drivers are working in excess of 56.5 hours per week, and that 42,000 drivers, some 40% of total drivers, are working in excess of 90 hours per fortnight on average. Now, part of the issue with this is drivers seeking some sort of recompense for depressed earnings, how they have seen their real wages reduce relative to other drivers, say, of trains or tube trains. And that divergence, where they once had parity, is a great cause of the additional hours that have been worked. It now means that, on average, bus drivers work nearly 6 hours per week more than average workers. So the bill's proposed move to EU regulation covers total hours worked, but also proposals to bring changes to mandatory breaks, which would ensure a break of no less than 45 minutes would be taken after no more than 4.5 hours of driving. At present, the entitlement to a 30-minute break after 5.5 hours behind the wheel often results in drivers taking smaller breaks or none at all, due to congestion on the route or other factors beyond their control. Neither is it a realistic time frame within which a driver can obtain proper rest and refreshment after 5.5 hours driving passengers on often complicated routes with frequent stopping. And importantly, the changes to hours in this bill should be introduced by employers at no detriment to bus drivers' pay. The culture of long hours amongst bus drivers is accompanied by low rates, which places a dubious incentive on overtime. Regulations must prevent this, but must also ensure that bus drivers are paid properly for the essential public service they provide. This is important at a time when operators are cutting unprofitable routes and local councils are cutting funding to bus services. Now, this all sounds pretty obvious, particularly when you look at what regulations apply in other European countries. But it is why so many of us are calling for change. And can I applaud Rowan's family for their petition in doing just that? Already, it has 2,800 signatures, mostly local, but which I am sure will build as this campaign makes further headway. Since my 10-minute rule bill was heard, the family and I met with the Minister responsible for buses, who disappointingly cannot be here today. It was an emotional meeting, and the Minister said she would look into this, and I appreciate her honesty and, I'm sure, commitment to do so. I've also met with representatives of the relevant unions to garner their views. The TUC, GMB and RMT are all backing this, as is the Mayor of Greater Manchester. I have met with those responsible for Transport for London to hear their concerns and better try and understand the reasons behind the 16 or 17 deaths averaging a year involving buses on the capital streets. I will certainly give way.
Honourable friend to giving way, because the accident actually happened in my constituency, and I thought it was only right and proper to come along today and support my honourable friend. But I mean, this is a byproduct of what we call deregulation. It came in about 30-odd years ago, and I'm really surprised that the government has never adopted the EU regulations in actual fact. So I would support my honourable friend, and I extend every sympathy to the families of those that were actually killed in that accident. And I hope that the government, for a change, will take some action rather than drag it out, and at the end of the day, nothing changes, because it's no comfort to those families concerned. Indeed, earlier this year, I met my honourable friend with members of the families of the victims in Westminster Hall, and as well out here. So we would support them all we can, and I congratulate them on securing this debate.
I thank my honourable friend for what he has to say, and I agree with him entirely about the marketisation of the bus sector and what pressures that's brought about on bus drivers, the hours they work, but also the pay and working conditions that they suffer as a result. Of course, that doesn't happen with tube drivers, for example, where that's not been allowed to happen. And we've seen this disparity, this widening divergence between tube driver pay and bus driver pay in the capital. And that's a good example of just what's been allowed to happen through this marketisation of local bus services. And can I thank my honourable friend for coming today. And I know that many others were hoping to be here today were it not for the by-election in Peterborough, where I'm sure we would have had a great many more. And unfortunately, that's just one of those problems with scheduling. When I met with Brake, the road safety charity, they were extremely impressed by this campaign and put their full support behind it, as did London Bus Watch, who were also very much supporters of the campaign. Mr. Brady, you will not be surprised to learn that I've also heard from many individual bus drivers who have approached me to share their stories and the reality of what is happening behind the existing legislation. Across the country, their responses have been clear and consistent. For example, a bus driver in Cornwall who actually drives on a route which is longer than 50 kilometres, so actually should come under strict EU rules for long-distance drivers. But the company, the local company, exploits a loophole and actually splits the route into 3, so that the same driver can continue that route and they therefore do not have to comply with EU working hours restrictions. A simple example of how companies are working the system. And in Liverpool, a driver who used to work for Stagecoach and said that they were regularly forced to work 12-hour shifts day after day, which caused fatigue. There are many others, but time will not permit me. The concern must therefore also be on who is enforcing existing legislation, what role and how resourced is the DVSA and likewise the Traffic Commissioner. What is as disturbing, and may come as a surprise, is that very few councils and local authorities have any bus safety data at all. Under a Freedom of Information Act by one of the campaign groups, of the 74 council and local authorities they approached, 46 councils say they have absolutely no bus safety data. 8 said they did, and 24 are yet to respond. So there is clearly much to do. Mr. Brady, from all of this, it is evident that what happened that day in Coventry city centre could have happened anywhere, and it is unlikely to be the last such accident. In fact, what is motivating me, and I'm sure Rowan's family, is to press on with this and our determination to ensure that there is no such repeat of the Coventry crash, but also ensure that no worse tragedy should ever occur. Unfortunately, I fear it is simply a matter of time unless the government should act. So may I sum up by repeating that this is simply a common sense, seeking to align the working hours legislation for local bus drivers to that of long-distance bus and coach drivers and lorry drivers, to bring safety to our streets and to avoid an even more serious tragedy, but not to impact on drivers' pay. It is sensible, it is pragmatic, it is certainly not radical. You only have to look at what happens in Germany and the Netherlands and the legislation that they have in place. Daily driving cannot exceed 9 hours in those countries, with an exemption of twice a week when it could be increased to 10 hours. But their total driving time is limited to 56 hours and total fortnightly of 90 hours. And the 45-minute breaks after 4.5 hours driving time. This is what is happening in other European countries. And we must also introduce independent, regular health checks. What happened in Coventry was evidence of where an individual was suspected of ill health, but for some reason that was not exposed and should have been. And therefore, under this bill, I am urging the Minister to include more regular, more independent health checks to ensure the safety of all our passengers and other road users. And all this could be introduced via a simple statutory instrument if the government so wished. So can I urge the Minister to review this with his colleague and with the Secretary of State? But in the meantime, the family and I will continue to press for the introduction of Rowan's Law. We have come a long way, but we will continue until Rowan's legacy is fulfilled. Thank you, Mr. Brady.